For some, life is a beautiful thing. An endless symphony with all of nature working in harmony. For others, however, life seems to be more like the music of an intoxicated street musician just moments before he's arrested. Nasty, brutish, and short. In reality, it's probably a combination of both. We've brought together a team of experts to explain why, using some fundamental biological questions like, how am I related to a mouse? Or, what is it good for? And am I hot or not? Just some of the things you need to know about evolution. Let's start with the most famous figure in natural history, Charles Darwin.
Charles Darwin is to biology what Newton was to physics. I mean, he changed the way we think about the world, not only how the world has changed, organism evolved, but the whole idea about life in general.
Darwin is really who we consider to be sort of the father of modern evolutionary theory.
It was a big breakthrough in thinking and philosophy.
It's amazing that somebody who was around for such a long time ago continues to be sort of our go-to person.
So given all that, perhaps the first question we should be asking is this: what did Darwin actually do? Unless you live under a rock, you'll have heard of Charles Darwin. But before developing his revolutionary theory of evolution, Darwin's life was somewhat non-biological. First, he quit medical school because it was always making him sick, and then very nearly entered the priesthood. So it's perhaps not surprising that Darwin wasn't the first person to suggest the idea of evolution.
There was a lot going on in the intellectual climate of the day.
The idea that evolution has occurred was not new. For example, Charles Darwin's own grandfather, he has written about that evolution has occurred, organisms have changed, and he talks about millions of ages, means the world is very old.
He was also influenced by Carolus Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist.
The so-called father of taxonomy. He had a classification system.
Linnaeus was the person who classified organisms, and he used a naming system that we still use pretty much today.
And he put humans with apes, on the basis of physical characteristics, which was quite revolutionary.
You know, the person that's probably most important is Charles Lyell, because Lyell was a geologist.
And Darwin's contemporary, and somebody Darwin very much respected.
He was interested in how the surface of the Earth changes and the fact that it's not static, but that, mountains sort of arise and lakes and rivers move around, and the idea that these are very gradual, slow changes over a long period of time. So as a human, you don't live long enough to see those changes happen, but they are happening. And so I think Darwin was really influenced by that because he figured, this could be applied to organisms too.
Darwin really got into naturalism at university, but had to find his sea legs to make a career of it. In 1835, he visited the Galapagos Islands. It was the unique nature of nature there that rocked Darwin's world. It began with Galapagos finches, whose beaks all looked different across the island chain. Each beak seemed to be adapted to whatever food was on offer, be it seed, cactus, or grub. Ugh. Darwin saw this as no coincidence and began to investigate other adaptations. His study took another 20 years to complete, but his conclusions went against everything the prevailing God-based theory said about life's origins. Darwin's take was that useful adaptations existed in all living species and were inherited through a process he called natural selection, and that nature alone was the driving force behind millions of years of evolutionary change. With that, Darwin became the daddy of modern biology. Not bad for a squeamish wannabe priest.
So the idea of evolution was there all the time. What people wanted was a mechanism. And this is his contribution, and that's why he took so much time to think about it, collect evidence, write about it.
Darwin believed that natural selection meant that there was an initial organism that became modified in some way.
If you have the environment exerting some pressure, be it in the form of a predator or a hazard or something like this, that the ones who have a trait that will allow them to survive and reproduce will be the ones that will have offspring that will survive to the next generation.
As a consequence, then, the animals we see today and the plants we see today are well adapted. They express the adaptations that make them successful in surviving and in reproducing.
But Darwin wasn't able to explain everything.
Well, so Darwin came up with this theory, but he didn't quite understand how it worked. And that's because he didn't really know about, sort of things at the molecular level, what was happening inside organisms, inside cells that make up organisms. So he didn't know about DNA, and he didn't know about, the way that DNA transmits this genetic information from one generation to the next. And he didn't understand anything about mutations. And mutations are interesting, right?
But if mutations are part of the evolutionary process, doesn't that throw up something of a terrifying question? Are we all mutants? Think mutant, and you might think Godzilla. But evolution's mutants are minute compared to him. Our story begins in the 1850s, when the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel discovered how genetic traits were inherited by breeding giant peas. But this only scratched the surface.
Mendel is known as the father of genetics. He actually figured out all the basic rules.
And in his monastery garden, he was breeding giant peas and dwarf peas. And instead of the offspring being sort of a blend of the parents,
if you cross a giant pea plant by a dwarf pea plant, the progeny are all giant pea plants.
That told Mendel that in fact there was a very strong influence of a genetic particle on those traits. We now know those particles as genes.
So that gave us the idea of dominance and recessiveness in genes.
The tall pea plants are the dominant form of the gene, and the dwarf pea plants are the recessive form of the gene.
He worked out sort of roughly what was going on, but he didn't understand the mechanism behind it. Again, a little bit like Darwin. So he was able to sort of come up with a theory, but he didn't know how it worked.
Then, in the 20th century, we discovered the hideous truth: molecular mutation. Not caused by experimentation, but microscopic errors in the genetic code hidden within each species.
A mutation is a mistake. Is a mistake in DNA replication.
I think everybody, when they think about mutations, they think about something that's happening immediately. They've all watched horror movies and seen one thing turn into another. It doesn't happen like that. It happens over the period of a generation or several generations.
Mutations are entirely random events, and most of the time, they're agents of evil. But occasionally, they're forces for good, offering mini upgrades like better vision, faster flight, or in the case of this monster, more bite. Meet Obtusacanthus, an extinct 400-million-year-old fish with a freaky face. In 2011, scientists found teeth outside its mouth. The theory is that the first teeth started out as fish scales that randomly mutated. But the randomness ends with natural selection, or death. If the mutation offers any kind of edge, it gets passed on to the next generation. Those without the mutation, well...
Mutations are random. There's nothing that we understand that directs where a mutation is going to alter the DNA sequence.
I would say 99.9% of mutations never see the light of day. But those who are few left, they may change the behavior of an organism in a very small manner.
Which ones end up being the ones that go forward? And that depends on the pressure from the environment. So that's where natural selection comes in.
It's sort of a blind agent, really, in that it simply means that some organisms will survive better than others.
If your particular mutations are useful, then you're more likely to be able to pass them on to the next generation.
These mutations accumulate all the time, and when they accumulate, they change the nature of the population.
Obtusacanthus's freaky face helped to hook its lunch. But it took millions of years for teeth to become a total mouthful, as seen in all the toothy mutants alive today. And yes, that includes you. This ties in with another vital part of Darwin's theory, concerning family relationships.
When you begin to look at the process of evolution, it would seem that the introduction of mutations into genes has led to diversification. Well, if you've diversified something and you sort of, it's like the idea of the Big Bang, you know, the idea that the universe is expanding. Well, the range of species is expanding. So if you were to sort of go backwards in time, then there must have been fewer species, and then therefore they're the ancestors of today's species.
I laugh when I read in the newspaper and somebody says, you know, Mr. Smith, no relation to, you know, Bob Smith. And I always say, of course we're related. I'm related to a mouse. I'm related to a bacterium. We're all related.
So, just how am I related to a mouse? At least 95% of the recipe book for Homo sapien, that's you, is the same for chimpanzee. With mice, the figure is about 85%. And cabbage, roughly 40%. That doesn't mean we're 40% cabbage. Nobody could stomach that much green. It means that some of the genetic instructions used during the cooking process are shared across species of both meat and veg.
All organisms today share certain sequences, certain genetic sequences that unite them.
Genes are made of DNA, but DNA relates to basically the material.
And there is really no difference in terms of the structure of DNA between organisms that are extremely far apart in terms of evolutionary origin.
And so you can see that a group of different species might be closely related because they share 90% of the genes with each other. And so that would suggest that they've diverged from each other relatively recently.
This information can be found in a vital chapter of the evolutionary cookbook called Common Ancestry. The living world is like a very large 3.8 billion-year-old tree, with today's organisms at the top. Go back in time, and you'd see where each species branches off. The earliest known human recipe is possibly Homo gautengensis, which is about 2 million years old.
The more difference you see between two different species, then the further back in time they're likely to have diverged.
Go back 160 million years, and you'll find the recipe for Jeremiah sinensis. Found in China in 2011, it's believed to be the oldest common ancestor of mice and humans, because they're the first known placental mammals that gave birth to live young. We're not really sure what the first ever recipe consisted of, but we've named it Luca, the last universal common ancestor. But I wouldn't try it if I were you. It's 3.8 billion years old.
It's really difficult to prove any of this, at least in real time. But you can't see evolution happening. At least it's very difficult to show someone. It's happening on a really long time scale that's beyond the comprehension of, you know, of most humans. And so it feels like nothing's happening. I think people think, you know, it looks like it's static, but it's not, it's changing.
One of the things we can do, though, is look at the patterns of development, how genes produce different traits, sort of where, you know, where does the backbone come from? How do ribs get produced? How are legs produced, and so on? That give us clues on how organisms are related evolutionarily, because they will share these kinds of genes, these kinds of instructions.
You can't really understand how genes work until you start to play with them and actually work with them.
So perhaps genes can help to answer some of science's age-old biological quandaries, like this one. Which came first, the dinosaur or the egg? There will always be a big market for fossils, but their value in trying to understand evolution does have a limit. If you really want to see evolution at work, you can't just rely on fossilized dinosaurs. But you might find eggs very useful. Or rather, what's inside them. Embryos possess all the biological know-how that species need to develop. And we've found they also contain information that can connect creatures alive today to their distant ancestors. Scientists in the Division of Evolutionary Developmental Biology, or EVO-DEVO, have been tinkering with certain genes in chicken embryos, exposing unchicken-like traits, like teeth and tails. These traits are evidence that chickens contain dinosaur DNA that's no longer needed. In fact, redundant DNA is pretty common. In humans, for example, only about 5% have confirmed employment. We're now trying to figure out what jobs, if any, the rest have, because a lot of it no longer appears to be doing anything.
In evolution, one idea has become common, there's a lot of waste. And one way to see that waste is that our cells have enough DNA to make hundreds of thousands of protein, but no more than 5% of the DNA makes protein. So what's the 95% is doing, which does not make protein? One idea is that a lot of genes have become silent, they are no longer leaded.
So our genome does contain genes that we don't currently express, but may have been expressed throughout our ancestral period.
So the information is there embedded, but it's not used. It's switched off or partly destroyed purposefully because it's not useful any longer. One of your ancestors may have acquired a mutation that's led to a gene becoming recessive or disappearing. It's a bit like your hard drive. You think you've wiped it, but the information's still there.
And that, in a way, is a evidence that organisms are related and evolution has occurred.
But the jobless workforce doesn't disappear. Inactive DNA can sometimes return to work, which can lead to atavisms. Evolutionary throwbacks like whales with tiny legs. The Evo-Devo scientists did a similar thing deliberately. But whether they'll actually put dinosaurs back in business full-time is largely speculation at the moment.
Well, it's an awful lot to create a dinosaur, to recreate a dinosaur. But I think it's not far-fetched to think that we can recreate many of the traits that existed, because many of those traits probably still exist.
Would we really want to bring dinosaurs back, though? I mean, haven't we got enough to contend with already?
Even though we have a lot in common, it seems that we're not really able to avoid being at war with each other. They build a bomb, we have to have a better bomb. We build a defense system, we have to figure out a way around it, and so on. Exact same thing exists in nature.
This leads to this concept of there's a sort of a war going on out there. You know, I don't have a very good relationship with sharks, you know, man-eating sharks. I mean, nature's a pretty nasty place. It's all about death and survival.
So, war. What is it good for? Planet Earth has been a war zone for millions of years. It's an arms race between predators and prey. Predators developed lethal weaponry like semi-automatic teeth. So prey evolved evasion strategies, like mimicry. Predators returned fire with protractile claws, only for prey to hit back with high-tech camouflage. But some species have gone further. Chemical warfare. Pit vipers are cutting-edge killers. Their venom is hemotoxic, preventing blood from clotting, and evolves very quickly.
Venom is something that has been around for a long time and shows up in many different organisms because it's a very effective way of subduing your prey, killing your prey, and so on, protecting yourself as well. Snakes as a group have been around for about 100 million years, and it appears that venomous snakes have been around for about 60 million years. But venom itself has been around for much longer. It was probably inherited from a previous reptilian ancestor. And so the genes for producing venom have been around in that lineage for quite a long time.
This should make them unrivaled assassins. But some viper species have a sworn enemy, the possum. In 2011, a blood-clotting gene from the Virginia possum was found to be evolving incredibly quickly, strengthening its resistance to the viper's bite, which explains why it can make such a dangerous opponent its prey. Both creatures are now locked in mortal combat, because without the possum, the viper would not have evolved as it did, and vice versa. Strategists call this co-evolution, which sees sworn enemies evolving together.
If you think of, two organisms locked in a predator-prey interaction, if one evolves the ability to avoid a particular tactic, then the other one is going to have to evolve some way of coming around this, or it will not be successful.
The prey is getting better at escaping, and the predator therefore responds in a sort of complementary way to become better at catching the prey.
So coevolution is this sort of tit for tat, where evolutionary changes in one organism are going to create evolutionary changes in another.
So, no cheetahs, no gazelles. No foxes, no hares. At least, not as they appear today. War is hell, but good luck trying to evolve as a pacifist.
Coevolution can also lead to what we call mutualism between two organisms, where two organisms depend on each other for their existence.
You know, things like symbiotic relationships that you see between bumblebees and flowers that have co-evolved and rely on each other in a sort of beneficial way. The bumblebee pollinates the flower provides food for the bumblebee. So, you know, or pilot fish, those fish you see swimming around sharks. The sharks don't eat the fish because the fish provide a kind of cleaning service.
So the shark clearly gets a benefit from having this cleaner fish basically be its toothbrush, and the cleaner fish also gains protection from being around the jaws of an angry shark.
So the relationship you have with your fellow species, good or bad, is clearly a vital component of evolution. But is there a reason why life is such hard work?
The ultimate goal of an organism from an evolutionary standpoint is not to survive. Just surviving to a long age, but not passing on your genes to offspring drops you out of the gene pool. So the success is measured in terms of how many offspring you leave behind and how successful those offspring are.
The whole point of life, it seems, if there is a point, it's to pass on your genes to the next generation, and you can't do that unless you reproduce. So, you know, then you've got to find a mate.
And the question you'll be asking yourself as you bid to attract that prospective mate is this: am I hot or not? Hotness is in the eye of the beholder. But looks aren't part of the package for all species. Some creatures measure hotness intrasexually, like those who fight for the right to procreate. Others compete intersexually, attempting to dance, sing, or buy their way into the arms of the opposite sex. Mating calls are a very popular approach. In 2011, a species of water boatman called Micronecta scholzi was found to have, pound for pound, the loudest mating call on Earth. Despite being just 2 millimeters long, it can hit 99 decibels, proving that size isn't everything. You'd think the boatman's vocals would be a dead giveaway to predators, but he could be what's called a Fisherian runaway. Named after biologist R.A. Fisher, the theory is that his call, or other traits like the peacock's plumage, don't seem to help with survival and might even get them killed.
Having a long tail is not good for peacock. It may hinder in moving in the forest. It may get, attacked by predators and so on.
It looks a bit foolish because that means males are going to be very easily spotted.
But it's exactly what their partner is looking for. This leads to a positive feedback loop, whereby the more pronounced the trait, the more it's favoured by the opposite sex in each new generation. A vicious evolutionary circle with the occasional happy ending.
You don't have to have sex to reproduce. Yeah. You could be a simple organism that just divides. I can't do that myself, but a bacteria can do that. That's what we call clones. And it's asexual. You simply make a copy of your DNA, so now you've got 2 copies, and then you divide and create 2 cells from one.
Asexually means that you really don't have a need for a male and mating. So let's think about dandelions in our gardens. They have a cell which is diploid and produces a dandelion plant without going through sexual differentiation.
So you don't need a partner to do that. Convenient.
Similarly, there are certain organisms like earthworm. You can chop an earthworm and you can produce different earthworm.
There's many types of reproduction that don't always involve sex, and in fact, in large parts of the tree of life, they're the rule rather than the exception.
Whatever your strategy, though, the ultimate evolutionary measure of hotness isn't looks, charm, or bruises. It's if you've got one of these.
Sex is great for creating diversity within species, but to get a bunch of different species, you need to throw something else into the mix, and that's geography.
But what has geography got to do with evolution? Animals first made landfall hundreds of millions of years ago, sort of. We now cover the face of the planet. But this wasn't just the result of our love for travel. Land masses divide, mountains rise, rivers become lakes, and when geography gets in the way, it interrupts the gene flow. Fold in other factors, like an erratic climate, and you get speciation, new species.
Geographical isolation is the basic and minimum necessity for speciation to occur.
When species get separated from each other, there's a bunch of different processes that are going to tend to make them different. One of them is genetic drift, the idea that traits can be lost randomly from two separated populations. The other is the environment is not going to be identical in those two places. If you think about, sort of a river valley separating two species.
They separate with the same genetic background and information, but now they can't interact any longer, so they might diverge.
The environment over here is not going to be identical to over here, so the traits that are best for surviving here aren't necessarily the traits that are best for surviving over here.
And gradually there are more and more mutations that accumulate as generations of organisms move farther apart.
So over enough time, these two populations will start to become very different, to the point that if that river valley collapses and now those two populations can come into contact, they may no longer be able to interbreed.
Eventually, those changes are significant enough for us to say that those are two different species.
Some creatures disappeared underground. Many became tree dwellers. Others went airborne. A handful returned to the life aquatic, with some becoming dolphins and whales. Millions of years of geographical change has led to a diverse population that today includes over 5,000 mammals, 10,000 birds, and 1 million+ insects.
How many species on Earth? It's a good question, and it's one we struggle with. The most current estimate is around 8.7 million. But it's very difficult to find all the species on Earth. We found most of the big ones. We're unlikely to find, a new species of elephant or something like that, let's say. But there's lots and lots of little organisms that are very poorly studied.
Insects, for instance. I mean, what is it? Half the world's described animals are beetles. So there's so many insects and so many beetles. And we're just now sort of understanding in the tropics, different habitats up in the canopy, et cetera. We're finding many, many more species.
There's a sampling problem. We just simply haven't had the ability to find all of the types of species and categorize them. But then there's also a question of really understanding what constitutes a separate species.
It's quite difficult to define what a species is. So at what point does someone say that this species is different from that one? It's kind of a vague definition, really.
But Earth's geography also brought some species back together, sort of, through convergent evolution. Sometimes, different creatures can face similar conditions, even in different parts of the world, and as a result, can evolve similar traits. Insect, bird, and batwings evolved over millions of years, and at different points in geological time. But it isn't always that obvious. Humpback whales and pelicans both feed by gulping masses of water into their mouths. This behaviour evolved independently, but led to a structurally similar expandable lower jaw. Incredible for two creatures that are worlds apart. Sort of.
The interesting point there is that these organisms don't have to occupy the same place at the same time in order to produce these similar adaptations. It can happen at different times as long as the environmental pressures are the same. So if you look at, sort of something in the fossil record or something now that was facing similar environmental pressures, you may see the same adaptations.
So that's an estimated 8.7 million species in total. But I wonder how long it took for life to become so diverse.
Speciation tells you a little bit about, how different organisms are related and how new organisms emerged, but it doesn't tell you the rate at which that happened. That's quite hard to do.
In the history of evolution, there has been a lot of controversy about rates of evolution.
So maybe the next question should be, is life a marathon or a sprint? According to Darwin, evolution runs at a steady pace, known as gradualism, and the track is inclined, with species evolving over marathon periods. But anyone trying to use the fossil record to prove this would find there were obstacles in the way.
If you took the biggest library of, sort of all of human knowledge, and you burned it to the ground, and out of that rubble you pulled out a scrap that was, an article on how to build an engine, and then there was something about sculpture in ancient Greece, and then there was how to apply makeup, or, and we're trying to use all these, disparate bits of information to reconstruct the past. That's essentially what we're trying to do from the fossil records.
Take, for example, the Cambrian explosion, a sub-aqua event held about 550 million years ago. Before this, ocean creatures were primarily soft-bodied, like sponges, who barely set any records at all. Then came the explosion, in which all manner of competitors seemed to burst forth in record time, perhaps less than 20 million years, with hardened skeletons and bilateral physiques.
The Cambrian explosion was a period of time when we see incredibly rapid diversification of animal bodies in particular.
The major different animal groups that we see today, from starfish to the ancestors of our own group, the vertebrates, fish, etc., ancestors to those were all present and all seem to come onto the scene very, very quickly in this explosion of life.
There appear to be sudden big changes in characteristics that the organisms possess. Suddenly, creatures having eyes where they didn't have any eyes at all, or some major structure that wasn't seen before suddenly emerges in a relatively short period of time.
We don't fully understand how life became so diverse so quickly. It could have been the result of an evolutionary arms race, or an environmental change that led some species to develop bony skeletons, which might explain why their records were so well kept. It was evidence like this, though, that led scientists to suggest a different pace, punctuated equilibrium, in which evolution combines huge leaps forward together with long periods of rest. So which is it? Well, there might not be an outright winner. It could have been long, steady runs for some, a faster rate for others, and a variety of speeds in between. The ultimate fitness workout. Sounds exhausting.
It's always the way, isn't it? There's no real simple explanation. It's a combination of factors. So I think there's good evidence to show that gradual evolution is happening, gradualism. The idea there's incremental changes over time, usually with certain traits and characteristics as they get gradually better. But then there are obviously these punctuated events, these short periods where we get a sudden jump, where there's significant changes in the evolution, and then you get new species arising.
So why did these very different animal clans suddenly jump onto the scene in the Cambrian period? There's a couple of theories that have been suggested.
One of the things that's sort of curious is when we look at the genetic evidence, it suggests that the genes that underlie these major changes in these body plans, because we're talking about organisms that are sort of really fundamentally different in the way their bodies are organized from each other, things like mollusks and insects and so on, very different bodies. So that those genes that underlay that were actually around for a long time before that, perhaps even like 100 million years before that.
What we see in the fossil record is different to what we guess might be happening at the genetic level. So some of the genes might have been there for a much longer period of time, and then maybe due to some natural selection pressures suddenly appeared.
It's a complicated story right now. We're not really sure exactly what it was that prompted things to happen at that point.
But regardless of how fast you live life, death will catch up with you eventually, and not just on an individual basis. We're talking species extinction.
What happens to species that don't make it? Well, I often tell my students, extinction's not a dirty word. Extinction is a fact of life, and in fact, it's sort of the fate of most organisms. Most species go extinct.
So, why do species go extinct? Statistically speaking, you're lucky to be here, because 99% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. The dinosaurs folded 65 million years ago, the last of 5 mass extinctions, killing off 75% of life each time. Man eliminated the dodo, one of almost 900 recorded species who've lost big since the year 1500. Invasive species are another serious problem, like the pet Burmese pythons we've let loose in Florida, who are now threatening several endangered populations.
When we bring species that were adapted to live somewhere else now into an environment that is different, we can create havoc. And one of the ways that we do create havoc is when we have species that have not evolved in the presence of the predators that are there. They are released from their enemies, essentially. They can become very successful, they can take over ecosystems and become very invasive.
So we have to be very, very careful of introductions of new species into anything, lakes, rivers, deserts, forests, because we don't know what these new species, what the effect these new species may have.
But however deadly we've become, in terms of geological time, the biggest killer is evolution itself. One of the worst hands a species can get dealt is a change in environment. When that happens, the large slow-breeding ones are normally the first to go. Lack of genetic diversity can also be an issue, especially for small populations. Fewer numbers mean that when useful genes are randomly lost, the species may just fold.
The smaller the population gets, just from a purely statistical point of view, the less likely they are to be different from each other.
If you're on an island, you can only mate with other members of the population on the island, and they may all have similar characteristics, so your offspring are all going to have similar characteristics.
There's little raw material for natural selection to work with, and so this can lead to extinction.
These natural causes have generated an estimated background extinction rate of roughly 1 species per million per year for the last 3.5 billion years. Thanks to us, the rate may now be more than 1,000 times that. But we do well to remember 2 things. When it comes to extinction, luck has very little to do with it, and the house always wins.
The question is, what is extinction? You know, I looked this up. It's actually not as clear-cut as you might think. You could say a species is extinct once the last individual from that species dies out. But, you know, in a number of cases, what you find is that a species has essentially gone extinct before that because they're unable to reproduce. So you get a shrinkage of the population and then an inability to reproduce altogether. So they might be extinct then, even though there are some animals still surviving.
No matter how you define it, though, extinctions are a fundamental part of the evolutionary process. But modern science is clearly going beyond simply trying to understand that process. And one area of research in particular has thrown up something of a blockbuster question. Can we create life? In 2011, Japanese and Russian scientists announced a plan to resurrect the woolly mammoth, attempting to turn science fiction into science fact. The plan, broadly speaking, is to inject DNA from a frozen mammoth into the egg of its closest living relative, the elephant. Then, they'll insert the egg into a female elephant's womb, where, fingers crossed, it will develop as a baby mammoth. Sounds complicated, because it is. If the DNA isn't perfectly intact, they'll be back to the drawing board.
The big challenge associated with this is that the DNA's got to be in good shape, and we know that DNA degrades very quickly after death, so it starts to break apart and become incomplete. And so there's a huge challenge involved when you're trying to recover DNA from a mammoth that's been frozen perhaps for 40,000 years and have that DNA of good enough quality that it would actually be able to produce a viable, a living organism.
But even if they get things right, there's still no guarantee it'll work. Stay tuned, though, because the scientists say mammoths could be returning to Earth by 2016. Not all attempts to create life are quite so, well, mammoth. In 2010, US scientists produced the world's first synthetic life form, a copy of a bacterial species using man-made DNA.
The process in creating synthetic life, I mean, keep in mind that the synthetic life is very, very simple. Essentially took an empty bacterial cell, took the DNA that existed in it, flushed it out, and replaced it with synthetic strands of DNA that essentially have been sort of stitched together to produce a functional DNA molecule.
When they did that, what happened was that the cell acquired all the characteristics that were coded for by the new DNA that had been put in, which is pretty amazing.
But I don't think that the experiment would have worked if they hadn't put the genome back into an existing cell, because it requires information from the existing cell.
That organism now is a new bacteria that has no parents. If you like, its parents are a computer, because the computer was used to design the genetic information that was then built and put in. So it was just a bionic bacterium.
OK, it doesn't look like much, and it wasn't really new life. Like any copy, it was based on an original. And like the Mammoth project, the artificial element required an organic host. In this case, an empty bacterial cell. Producing something totally original, self-replicating molecules with a novel genetic code that doesn't require a host organism is still science fiction at the moment. But if it ever becomes science fact, it'll be an instant classic. Evolution 2.0.
The critical difference between what scientists are trying to do is we have a goal in mind. We might be trying to create an organism with a particular set of traits. However, evolution didn't do that. Evolution was not directed towards any goal. It simply is a question of who survives best.
So what did motivate the scientists to create synthetic life?
I think that the motivation was to find a minimal genome, first of all. So they were originally trying to figure out how few genes we can survive with. And if you can make new life using a very minimal number of genes, then you can use that as the basis to make more changes and see what adding new genes will allow the organism to do.
What it shows is that we now have the capability to build organisms, essentially, at least from the ground up. So we can do amazing things. But it's hard to do because not only do you have to build the library of genes, the genome, for this new organism, you also have to put it inside a living organism and allow that information to be translated into functioning parts of an animal or a species, whatever. You know, the more complicated the species you're trying to do that with, the more difficult it becomes. We can do it with single-celled organisms right now. We can't do it with human beings yet, or any kind of mammal. It's too difficult.
So it's incredible to think that from one simple organism that emerged 3.8 billion years ago, life diversified and adapted to inhabit every corner of the planet. Though not without some casualties along the way. And this story is even more impressive when you consider that a lot of what we now know is based on the work of just one man.
Everything in biology, whether it's physiology, ecology, geology, there is no simple one idea which proves that evolution has occurred. But in the last 150 years since Darwin wrote his book, there has never been a piece of evidence of any kind which refutes evolution.
It can be a challenge because for many people it's sort of a revolutionary way of looking at things. But once you start looking at the patterns in life, it becomes so self-evident and obvious. And when we start sort of understanding natural phenomena and as I say, the beauty of the diversity of life, it makes so much more sense in the evolutionary context.
Yet despite all the new discoveries we're making, there's clearly lots more to find out.
We keep opening doors that lead us into realms that we never knew existed, so I don't think we're anywhere close to exhausting the questions of what makes up life yet.
So no matter where we're headed, our evolutionary future is bound to be full of surprises.